Okay, after we enter the rack, the first module we need to enter in slot 1 is the power supply. Power supplies of the 300 PLCs are listed in a subgroup in a PS300 folder here. As you can see here, these power supplies are gathered into 3 groups: 2 amp, 5 amp, and 10 amp. Okay, now what is the reason for grouping this output current? Why are we supposed to have power supplies with different output currents? See, whenever any electrical or any electronic device is on, it uses a certain amount of electrical current. For example, when you turn on a TV, it needs to use up a certain current with a specific voltage to be on. If the current gets disconnected, the TV will turn off. In a PLC, each and every one of the modules also needs to use a certain amount of electrical current in order to turn on and stay on. The power supply provides this electrical current. Therefore, the output current that a power supply provides us should not be less than the total current that all the modules use up. In other words, the output current of the power supply has to be such that it is able to keep all the PLC modules on. In electrical enclosures, we have other facilities in addition to the PLC modules that also need a power supply to be on and that use current. For instance, if we use an LED light for the lighting of the inside of the enclosure, this light uses up a specific amount of current. Or, for example, if we have a signal beacon in the enclosure, this also needs a power supply and uses up electrical current when it's on. Therefore, in order to choose a suitable power supply, we need to figure out the total current being used up in our facilities in the enclosure, and then choose a power supply with a proper output current based on that. In order to find out the current used in all the modules and in the facilities we have in the enclosure, we can simply find the current used in all the facilities one by one from their manuals, and then add them all up. For example, if the total current used in all the facilities is approximately 3 amperes, we can consider a 5 amp power supply for our enclosure. In some cases, where we have quite a few facilities in the enclosure, we can use 2 separate power supplies. For instance, we can use one power supply just to turn on the PLC modules, and another power supply for the rest of the facilities and interfaces that we have in the enclosure. Okay, so this is how we choose a suitable power supply for our control facilities. Now, let's see how we can choose our power supply in the hardware configuration environment and place it on the rack. If we click on any of the power supplies we have here, we can see its properties in the box below. For instance, if we click on this 2 amp power supply here, we can see its order number in this box, and its output and input voltages, and how much current it can provide us. As you can see, the input voltage of this power supply can be anywhere between 120 and 230 volts AC. This means that to turn this power on, we can simply connect it to the city power, just like other electronic or electric appliances we have at home. So, now what is its output voltage? On here, it says the output voltage of this power supply is 24 volts DC. What does this mean? This means that this power supply can turn on the facilities that work with 24 volts DC, meaning that the facilities that need a 24 volt DC power in order to be on can be turned on by this power supply. Generally, most of the facilities we have in an enclosure work with 24 volt DC voltage. So, as you can see, the output voltage that these Siemens power supplies gives us is 24 volt DC. Therefore, all the power supplies we have in here receive a power between 120 and 230 volts AC and give out a 24 volt DC voltage. Okay, we said the power supply we want to use in the enclosure is a 2 amp power supply. However, we see that in our software environment, we have 3 kinds of 2 amp power supplies. So how can we figure out which one to use? To do so, we need to see the order number of the power supply we have in the enclosure, and then we choose the same one and place that on the rack in the software environment. The order number of Siemens modules are written on the front. For example, the order number of the power supply we have in here is 6ES7 307 1BA01 0AA0. So, as you can see, the order number of the power supply we have here matches with what we need. Okay, now we need to place this power supply on the rack. To do so, we choose our desired slot on the rack first, and then we double-click on our module so that it gets on the rack. After our module gets on the rack, if we click on it, we can see its complementary information, such as its order number in this window below. The point regarding the order number of the power supplies and hardware configurations is that if we place a power supply with a different order number from what we have in the enclosure in here, and then we download the configuration on the CPU won't send any error messages. Even if we don't do the configuration of the power supply in this environment and we don't place it on the rack, there won't be any problems in hardware configuration. Therefore, placing the power supply in hardware configuration is optional, meaning that we can place it in here on the rack, but if we don't do so, there won't be any particular problems. But please note that what we just said only applies to power supply. However, for the rest of the PLC modules, we need to place the exact same module we have in the enclosure with the exact same order number here on the rack. The other point we have here is that in order to provide energy supply for the S7 PLC modules, we don't have to necessarily use a Siemens power supply. We can use any power supply that can provide us with a voltage and a secured current for that purpose. Okay, so the things we learned in this lesson about the power supply are as follows. Power supplies are usually categorized based on their output current, and in order to select a power with a suitable current, we need to find the electrical current used by each and every one of the facilities in the enclosure. And then we add them all up and choose a suitable power supply with a suitable output current based on the total current being used. We also learned that entering the power supply in hardware configuration is optional, meaning that we can place it here on the rack. However, if we don't do so, and we download the configuration to the CPU without the power supply, the CPU won't send any error messages. The reason for this is that we can use any power that can provide us with a voltage and secured current for the PLC modules, rather than using a Siemens power supply.